Chapter 16, in which the keeper of the seals, Seguir, looked more than once after the bell that he might ring it as he had been used to do. It is impossible to form an idea of the impression which these few words produced on the king. He grew red and pale by turns, and the cardinal saw immediately that he had regained by a single stroke all the ground that he had previously lost. "The Duke of Buckingham at Paris," said the king, "and what has he been doing there? No doubt plotting with your enemies, the Huguenots and the Spaniards. No, by God, no! Plotting rather against my honor with Madame de Chevreuse, Madame de Longueville, and the Conde. Oh, sir, what an idea! The Queen is too good, and above all loves your Majesty too well." "Woman is feeble," said the king. "And as for her loving me too well, I have my own opinion about that. Nevertheless, I maintain the Duke of Buckingham came to Paris for an entirely political object. And I am just as sure that he came for other purposes, but if the Queen is guilty, let her tremble. After all," said the cardinal, "however unwilling I am to dwell upon a treason of this kind, your Majesty, by your words, reminds me that Madame de Lannoy, whom, by your Majesty's order, I have several times questioned, told me this morning, the night before last, the Queen was up very late, that this morning she was weeping very much, and that she had been writing throughout the whole day." "That confirms it," said the king. "Writing to him, no doubt. Cardinal, I must have the Queen's papers." "But how are we to get them, sire? It appears that neither I nor your Majesty ought to undertake such an office." "How did they proceed toward the Marshal d'Ancre?" said the king in a most violent rage. "They first ransacked her chests, and at last searched her person." "The Marshal d'Ancre was the only Marshal d'Ancre, a Florentine adventuress, but the august spouse of your Majesty is Anne of Austria, Queen of France. That is, one of the greatest princesses in the world." "That only makes her the more criminal. The more she has forgotten the high position to which she is placed, the lower she has fallen. For a long time now I have been determined to put an end to all these petty intrigues of politics and love. There is also one Laporte in her service, whom I believe to be the master spirit in all this." "Then you think as I do, that she is deceiving me," said the king. "I believe, and I repeat it to your Majesty, that the Queen plots against the king's power, but I have not said against his honor. And I tell you against both. I tell you that the Queen does not love me. I tell you that she loves another. I tell you she loves this infamous Duke of Buckingham. Why did you not arrest him whilst he was in Paris?" "Arrest the Duke? Arrest the Prime Minister of Charles I. Think, sire, what a commotion! And then, if the suspicions of your Majesty had any foundation, which I much doubt, what a dreadful exposure! What horrible scandal! But if he exposed himself to it like a vagabond and a pilferer, he ought—" Louis stopped, catching himself on the verge of a dreadful expression, whilst Richelieu, stretching out his neck, in vain expected the word which hung upon the king's lips. "He ought—" "Nothing," said the king, "nothing. But," added he, "during all the time that he was in Paris, you did not ever lose sight of him?" "Never, sire." "Where did he reside?" "In the Rue de la Harpe at number 75. "Where's that?" "Near the Luxembourg." "And you are certain that the Queen and he did not see each other?" "I believe that the Queen is too much attached to her duty, sire." "But they corresponded. It is to him that the Queen was writing all day. Duke, I must have those letters." "Sire, and yet, Duke, at whatever cost, I must have them. I would observe to your Majesty, however—" "And would you also betray me, Cardinal, since you thus oppose my wishes? Are you also in league with the Spaniard and the English, with Madame de Chevreuse and with the Queen?" "Sire," replied the cardinal with a smile, "I thought myself far removed from any such suspicion." "But, Cardinal, you hear what I say. I will have these letters." "There can only be one way." "What is that?" It is to charge Monsieur de Seguir, the keeper of the seals, with this commission. The matter is wholly within his scope. Let him be sent for immediately. He must be at my house, sire. I sent for him there, and when I came to the Louvre, I left word that he should wait for me. Let him be sent for instantly. Your Majesty's orders shall be executed, but what? But the Queen may perhaps refuse to obey. What, my orders? Yes, if she does not know that these orders come from the King. Well, then, that she may have no doubt, I will convey the orders to her myself. Your Majesty will not forget that I have done all I could to prevent a rupture. Yes, Duke, yes, I know that you're very indulgent, perhaps too indulgent to the Queen, and I can tell you we must have some talk about that hereafter. Whenever your Majesty pleases, but I shall always be happy and proud to sacrifice myself for the harmony for which I should wish to see between the King and the Queen of France. Well and good, Cardinal, but in the meantime send for the Chancellor, and now I hasten to the Queen. Then, opening the door of communication, Louis entered the corridor, which led from his own apartments to those of Anne of Austria. The Queen was surrounded by her ladies, Madame de Guitaut, Madame de Sable, Madame de Montbazon, and Madame de la Germine. In a corner was the Spanish lady of the bedchamber, Donna Estefana, who had accompanied Her Majesty from Madrid. Madame Gamine was reading aloud, and everyone was listening to her, except the Queen, who had promoted this reading that she might, under the pretense of paying attention, indulge the train of her own thoughts. These thoughts, all gilded as they were by a dying beam of love, were not therefore the less sad. Anne of Austria, deprived of the confidence of her husband, pursued by the hatred of the cardinal, who could never pardon her repulsion of a softer sentiment, and having constantly before her eyes the case of the Queen Mother, whom that hatred had tormented throughout her life, although if the memoirs of the times are to be believed, Marie de Medici had begun by granting to the cardinal the sentiment which Anne of Austria had persisted in refusing him. Anne of Austria had seen her most devoted servants, her most confidential companions, her dearest favorites fall around her. Like those unhappy beings which are endowed with a baleful nature, she brought misfortune upon everything she touched. Her friendship was a fatal gift which attracted persecution. Madame de Chevreuse and Madame de Vernal were banished, and Laporte did not conceal from his mistress that he was in momentary expectation of an arrest. It was at the very instant that she was profoundly indulging in these melancholy reflections that the door opened and the king entered. The reader became immediately silent, the ladies arose, and all was silence. As for the king, he made no show of politeness, only stopping before the queen. "Madame," said he in a nervous voice, "you are about to receive a visit from the Chancellor, who will make known to you certain commands with which I have charged him." The unhappy queen, who was often threatened with divorce, with exile, and even with death, grew pale beneath her rouge, and could not restrain herself from saying, "But why that visit, sire? What can the Chancellor have to say which your Majesty could not tell me personally?" The king turned on his heel without any answer, and almost at the same moment the captain of the guards, Monsieur de Guitaut, announced the presence of the Chancellor. Before the Chancellor appeared, the king had already left the apartment by another door. The Chancellor entered, half smiling and half blushing. As we shall probably fall into his company again in the course of this history, there will be no harm in our readers making acquaintance with him now. The Chancellor was a pleasant fellow. It was by de Rox de Mal, a canon of Notre Dame, which had formerly been the cardinal's valet, that he had been recommended to his eminence as one entirely devoted to his interests. The cardinal trusted him, and he was always well served. The following is one of the many stories which were circulated concerning him. After a stormy youth, he had retired into a monastery to expiate, at least for a time, the follies of his juvenile years. But in entering into this holy place, the poor penitent had been unable to close the door so quickly but that the passions which he flew from could enter with him. They worried him, in fact, unceasingly, and the superior to whom he had confided this disgrace, and who wished to preserve him from it as far as he was able, advised him, in order to drive out the diabolical temper, to have recourse to the bell-rope, and to pull it with his utmost might, since, on hearing this admonitory sound, the monks would understand that a brother was beset by temptation, and the whole community would instantly proceed to prayers. The counsel seemed good to the future chancellor, who exorcised the evil spirit by a large volume of prayers, which were offered up by the monks. The devil, however, is not easily displaced when he is once got into garrison, and in proportion as these exorcisms were multiplied, the temptations were increased, so that the unceasing clamor of the bell, by day and by night, perpetually announced the extreme need of mortification which the penitent experienced. The monks no longer enjoyed a moment's rest. By day they did nothing but go up and down the chapel stairs, and by night, besides complines and matins, they were obliged to jump out of their beds at least 20 times, to prostrate themselves upon the flooring of their cells. It is not known whether the devil quitted his hold or the monks got tired out, but at the end of 3 months the penitent reappeared in the world, with a reputation of being more terribly possessed by the evil spirit than anyone who had ever lived. On leaving the convent, he entered the magistracy, and became president in the place of his uncle. He then joined the cardinal's party, in doing which he evinced no small sagacity, became chancellor, served his eminence zealously against Anne of Austria, stimulated the judge in the business of Chalais, encouraged the efforts of the royal foremaster, Monsieur de Laffemas, and finally invested with the fullest confidence of the cardinal, which he had so well won, he had just received that singular commission in the execution of which he now presented himself before the queen. The queen was standing when he entered, but as soon as she perceived him, she seated herself in her easy-chair, and making a sign for her ladies to place themselves on their cushions and stools, said, in a tone of supreme haughtiness, "What do you want, sir, and for what object did you come here? To make, madame, in the king's name, and without abating the respect which I entertain for your majesty, an exact examination of all your papers." "What, sir? An examination of my papers? Of mine? Truly it is a more disgraceful act." "Deign to pardon me, madam, but in this affair I am only an instrument of the royal will. Has not his majesty but just left the room, and did not he himself invite you to expect this visit?" "Search, then, sir. I am, it seems, a criminal. Estefana, give up the keys of my tables and desks." The chancellor went through the formality of searching throughout the room, although he well knew that it was not there that the queen would hide the important letter which she had that day written. But when he had at least 20 times opened all the drawers and shut them again, it became necessary, in spite of any hesitation he might experience, to end the business by searching the queen herself. The chancellor advanced, therefore, towards her majesty, and with a nervous tone and manner said, "And now I must make the principal search." "And what is that?" demanded the queen, who did not, or rather would not, understand him. "His majesty is certain that a letter has been written by you during the day, and he knows that it has not yet been forwarded to its destination. The letter is not to be found either on your table or in your desk, and yet it must be somewhere." "Would you dare to lay your hand upon your queen?" asked Anne of Austria, assuming all her haughtiness, and fixing on the chancellor eyes which had become almost threatening. "I am a faithful subject of the king, madame, and everything that his majesty may order I shall execute." "Well, it is true," exclaimed the queen, "and the spies of the cardinal have served him faithfully. I have written a letter today, and that letter is not gone, it is here." And her majesty placed her beautiful hand upon her bosom. "Give me the letter, then, madame," said the chancellor. "I will only give it to the king, sir," said the queen. "If his majesty had wished the letter to be handed to him, madame, he would have demanded it himself. But, I repeat, it is to me that he gave the order to obtain it, and if you do not give it up, well, what then? It is me that has been ordered to take it." "How? What can you mean?" "That my orders go very far, madame, and that I am authorized to seek for this suspected paper, even on the person of your majesty." "Horrible!" exclaimed the queen. "Be more compliant, then, madame." "This conduct is infamous in its violence. Cannot you see that, sir?" "The king commands it. Therefore, madame, excuse me." "I will not endure it. No, no, I will die rather," said the queen, in whom the imperial blood of Spain and Austria revolted at the outrage. The chancellor made a most reverential bow, but it was evident that he did not mean to recede one step in the accomplishment of his commission. Just as an executioner's man might have done in the torture chamber, he approached Anne of Austria, from whose eyes large tears of rage were gushing. The queen was, as we have already said, of a singular beauty. The commission, therefore, was a delicate one, but the king had come from very jealousy of Buckingham to be no longer jealous of any other person. At that moment the chancellor, Seguir, was no doubt looking for the rope of the memorable bell, but, not finding it, he summoned up his resolution, and moved his hand toward the place where the queen had admitted that the paper was concealed. Anne of Austria, blanched as though it had been by the approach of death, receded for a single step. Then, supporting herself by leaning with her left hand on a table which stood before her, she drew with her right the paper from her bosom, and presented it to the keeper of the seals. "Here, sir, take the letter," cried the queen in a trembling, sobbing voice. "Take it and free me from your odious presence." The chancellor, who was also trembling from an emotion easy to conceive, took the letter, bowed to the very ground, and withdrew. Scarcely was the door closed upon him before the queen fell nearly senseless into the arms of her women. The chancellor carried the letter to the king without having read one syllable of its contents. His majesty took it with a trembling hand, and looked for the address, but, finding none, he became very pale and opened the letter slowly. Then, seeing by the first words that it was addressed to the King of Spain, he read it very rapidly. It was a complete plan of attack against the cardinal. The queen invited her brother and the Emperor of Austria to make a show, offended as they were by the policy of Richelieu, whose constant aim it was to humble the House of Austria by declaring war against France, and to lay down the dismissal of the cardinal as a condition of peace, but of love there was not one single word in all the letter. The king, in great delight, inquired whether the cardinal was still at the Louvre. The answer was that his eminence was in the official cabinet, awaiting his majesty's commands. The king immediately hastened to him. "Here, Duke," said he, "you were right and I was wrong. The whole intrigue is political, and love was not the subject of this letter. But on the other hand, there's a good deal about you." The cardinal took the letter and read it with the greatest attention, and when he had reached the end, he read it a second time. "Well, your majesty," said he, "you see how far my enemies go. They threaten you with 2 wars if you do not dismiss me. Truly, sire, in your place I would yield to such pressing inducements, and on my part I should be truly happy to retire from affairs of state." "What are you saying, Duke?" "I say, sire, that my health fails under these excessive struggles and internal labors. I say that in all probability I shall be unable to support the fatigues of the siege of La Rochelle, and that it would be better for you to appoint either Monsieur de Condé or Monsieur de Bassompierre or some other valiant man, whose profession is to conduct a war instead of me, a churchman, continually turned aside from my vocation to engage in affairs for which I am entirely unfit. You will be more prosperous in the interior of the kingdom, sire, and I doubt not you will also be more triumphant abroad." "Duke," said the king, "your irony does not deceive me. Depend upon it all, that those who are mentioned in the letter shall be punished as they deserve, even the queen herself." "What can your majesty mean? God forbid that the queen should be harassed upon my account. She has always believed me her enemy, sire, though your majesty can testify that I have ever taken her part warmly, even against yourself. Oh, if she betrayed your majesty's honor, it would be a very different thing, and I should be the first to say, 'No mercy, sire, no mercy on the guilty.' Happily, there is nothing of the kind here, and your majesty has just obtained a new proof of her innocence." "It is true, Cardinal, and you were right, as you always are, but yet the queen has nonetheless deserved all my anger." "It is you, sire, who have incurred hers, and when she seriously resents your conduct, I shall not blame her. Your majesty has treated her with great severity. It is thus that I will always treat my enemies, and yours, Duke, however lofty they may be, and whatever risk I may incur from being severe toward them. The queen is my enemy, but not yours, sire. She is, on the contrary, a submissive, irreproachable, and devoted wife. Permit me, then, to intercede for her with your majesty." "Let her humble herself, then, and make the first overtures." "On the contrary, sire, set her the example. You were wrong first, since you were suspicious of the queen." "Make the first overtures?" said the king. "Never." "Sire, I beseech you. Besides, how could I make overtures?" "By doing something which you know will be agreeable to her." "What?" "Give a ball. You know how much the queen loves dancing, and I will answer for it that her anger will not resist such an attention." "Cardinal, you know that I do not like these worldly pleasures." "Her majesty will be only the more grateful to you, as she knows your antipathy toward this amusement. Besides, it will enable her to wear those beautiful diamond studs which you gave her on her birthday, and which she has not yet had any opportunity to adorn herself." "We shall see, Cardinal, we shall see," said the king, who, in his delight at finding the queen merely guilty of a fault about which he did not much care, and innocent of a crime which he had greatly dreaded, was quite ready to reconcile himself with her. "We shall see, but upon my honor you are too indulgent." "Sire," said the cardinal, "leave severity to ministers. Indulgence is a regal virtue. Make use of it, and you will reap its benefits." Hearing the clock strike 11, the cardinal made an obeisance, and begged permission to retire, beseeching his majesty to make his peace with the queen. Anne of Austria, who, after the seizure of her letter, expected some reproaches, was much surprised the next day to see the king make some attempts at a reconciliation with her. The first emotion was repulsion. Her pride as a woman and her dignity as a queen had both been so cruelly outraged that she was unable to meet these first advances of the king. But, vanquished by the advice of her ladies, she at last appeared to be disposed to forgiveness. The king took advantage of this favorable moment to tell her that he thought of giving an immediate entertainment. An entertainment was so rare a thing to the poor queen that at this declaration, as if the cardinal had foreseen, the last trace of her resentment vanished, if not from her heart, at any rate from her countenance. She asked on what day this entertainment was to be given, but the king answered that on that point he must consult the cardinal. Not a day elapsed, in fact, but the king asked the cardinal when it was to be, and day by day his eminence deferred it upon some pretext or other. Thus did 10 days pass away. On the 8th day after the scene we have described, the cardinal received a letter with a London postmark, and containing only these few lines: "I have got them, but cannot leave London for want of money. Send me 500 pistols, and 4 or 5 days after having received them, I shall be in Paris." On the very day that the cardinal received this letter, the king asked the usual question. Richelieu counted on his fingers and said to himself in a low voice, "She will reach Paris," she says, 4 or 5 days after the receipt of this money. 4 or 5 days will be required for the money to get there. 4 or 5 days for her to return. That makes 10 days. Allow for the contrary winds and accidents of fate and the weakness of a woman, and let us fix it at 12 days. "Well, Duke," said the king, "have you calculated?" "Yes, sire, this is the month of September. The city magistrates will give an entertainment on the 3rd of October. That will suit exactly, for you will not have the appearance of going out of your way to please the queen." Then the cardinal added, "By the way, sire, do not forget to tell Her Majesty the evening before this fete that you wish to see how the diamond studs become her."